The volcano was already bleeding. When Sergeant Mara Voss decided she'd had enough of following orders, she stood at the perimeter tape, red and white, flapping in the sulfur wind, with her clipboard wedged under her arm and the evacuations manifest, half-filled and utterly useless. Behind her, 300 meters of black rock sloped down to the tourist center. Ahead of her, the lava field glowed in the creases of the earth like something alive and irritated. Somewhere, in the cave system beneath that field were two civilians who had not come out when the alert sounded. She already knew who they were. The ranger had told her, a teenage boy and his nanny, of all things. Boy's name was Ben. The nanny's name was Kara. They had gone in 2 hours ago, with a group that had since returned, -2. And the group had the blank, stunned look of people who'd had the sense to leave but not quite the courage to admit they'd left someone behind. Mara wrote their names on the last line of the manifest. Then she folded the manifest and put it in the chest pocket of her fatigues, and ducked under the tape and walked toward the cave mouth. Commander's voice came through the radio, clipped to her shoulder. He told her the fissure was rated critical. He told her the seismic team had logged 3 significant tremors in the last 40 minutes. He told her she was not authorized to go in alone. Copy, she said, and kept walking. She was not fearless. That was something she'd had to learn to say out loud over the years. That the absence of fear wasn't bravery, it was a malfunction. And she did not have a malfunction. What she had was a calculation. The variables that made going in more acceptable than staying out. 2 people. No other volunteers. The cave mouth still passable. That was the math. She'd done this long enough to know that the math was also sometimes wrong. That variables omitted themselves. That the ceiling you couldn't see was the one that came down. She held all of that in one hand and the clipboard in the other. And then she put the clipboard on the ground, next to the perimeter tape, and went in. The entrance swallowed her. Inside, the sulfur was heavier, the light gray and directional. Her headlamp cutting a pale cone through mineral-smelling dark. The cave was not small. Tourist signs were still up. Geological notation on laminated placards, distances in meters, a crude map bolted to the wall at the first fork. She noted it and moved deeper. She found Kara 40 meters in, sitting with her back to a basalt shelf, one hand braced on the ground, breathing through her teeth. Ankle was wrong. The angle of it, even in the bad light, said it had gone sideways on something. She was holding her phone up as a light, and the screen was cracked, and she was watching the entrance tunnel with the particular stillness of someone who has been very afraid for a long time and has moved past the acute stage into a kind of numb waiting. She looked up when Mara's headlamp found her. "Took you long enough," Kara said. Mara almost laughed. She knelt and looked at the ankle. Bad sprain, possibly a low fracture, not a compound break. Walkable with support. She pulled the compression wrap from her kit and started binding it. "Where's Ben?" she said. Kara pointed deeper. He heard something. Went to look. She paused. "About 20 minutes ago. You couldn't stop him?" "I was on the floor." Another pause, quieter. "He's 13. Tied off the wrap and helped Kara to her feet, and Kara hissed and then steadied. They went deeper together. Kara's arm around Mara's shoulders, moving in careful, matched steps. The cave narrowed and then opened again. The sounds from above, tremors, distant and structural, the mountain talking to itself, came through the rock as vibration more than noise, a low hum that lived in the soles of their boots. They found Ben at the back of a secondary chamber, crouching at the lip of a crack in the floor. The crack was roughly a meter wide and ran at a diagonal across the chamber. It was not, as far as Mara could see, a crack that should have been there. It looked recent. The edges were raw and the darkness below was absolute. Ben was staring into it. "There are lights down there," he said, without turning around. Mara said, "We're leaving." "Not regular lights. Fires. Like city lights. Like looking down at a city from a plane." Kerr said, "Ben, I'm not making it up." The floor moved. It moved in the way that floors should not move. A slow, nauseating lateral shift that sent Kursa stumbling into Mara's side, and Ben's hands shot out to brace against the crack's edge. And a section of the ceiling to their left came down in a single slab that hit the ground and bounced and settled in a cloud of dust. Crack widened. Then the floor went away. Mara had time for one clear thought, not fear, not prayer, Just the sergeant's instinct, find the ground. It never came. The drop was long and dark, and she hit something that was not the bottom in the way she'd expected, but instead a slope, a chute of compressed volcanic ash that had been shaped by thousands of years of runoff into something almost like a slide, and she went down it fast. And Ben was somewhere ahead of her making a sound she'd classify as involuntary, and Kara was behind her making no sound at all. They came out at the bottom of the chute into light. Not firelight, not headlamps or bioluminescent fungi, or any of the things a rational mind assembles when it tries to explain underground brightness. This was a sky, or something that functioned as one, a dome of pale amber rose, vast and curving, lit from within, the stone above them so thin in places that it glowed, backlit by some thermal process, and the effect was of a sun behind tissue paper, permanent and sourceless and beautiful. Below it, a city. Mara sat on the debris slope at the base of the chute and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Ben, who was already on his feet, and at Kara, who was sitting with both hands flat on the warm ground, and an expression that suggested she was questioning every decision she'd made in the last 24 hours. "Okay," Mara said. That was all she said, because the other things, the disbelief, the cataloging of impossibility, the urge to transmit up the chain and be told what to do, none of that was useful. She was a sergeant. There were 2 civilians in her care. She had no exit. Those were the variables. The city was real. They were going into it. It was not what she would have called a city if she'd designed it from scratch. The architecture was organic in the literal sense. Built along the shapes of the cavern, sprawling where the cavern was wide, and rising in stacked tiers where the rock walls narrowed. The construction material was something between stone and chitin, dark and iridescent where the light caught it. The streets were open and irregular. There were towers that served no obvious structural purpose, thin and needle-like, built with a density that reminded her of coral. And there were people. They were not immediately obviously not human, that was the uncanny part. They walked upright on 2 legs. They had faces that were arranged in roughly the expected way. Eyes, nose, mouth, the general orientation of a forward-facing predator adapted to sociality. The proportions were different in ways that accumulated. Too tall on average, heads slightly too large. The skin had a quality that was hard to name. Not quite any color she recognized, more like the surface of the cave walls behind them. Something organic and mineral at the same time. The eyes were the specific wrong thing. Wide and pale, adapted to this amber half-light, with irises that didn't quite track the way human irises tracked, that seemed to catch and hold Mara's gaze the way a mirror does, giving nothing back. Clothes they wore were not primitive. That surprised her. Cloth, not animal skin. Something manufactured, layered, purposeful. The city that surrounded her was not primitive either, and she let herself register that fully now. Plumbing, or something like it, in conduits along the lower walls. A light source that was engineered, not natural. Streets that had been maintained, repaired, built upon over time. These were not people who were starting. These were people who had been going, for a very long time, underground. They stopped when they saw her. Not all of them, not all at once. But there was a ripple, a pause that moved through the nearest crowd, the way a wind moves through grass. And then the pause spread, and within 30 seconds there was silence in the street, around them, and a semicircle of tall, pale-eyed people standing at a distance of about 8 meters, all watching. Put herself in front of Ben and Kara. Old reflex, one of the watchers stepped forward. She was taller than average, even here. The clothes she wore were in a functional sense, not armor, but structured, layered, built for movement. She had a quality of stillness that Mara recognized. Someone accustomed to command. She spoke. The language was clicks and longer vowel sounds, and something that resonated in the chest cavity rather than the ears. A frequency Mara felt before she heard it. She had no frame for it, Mara said. "My name is Sergeant Mara Voss. These 2 are civilians in my care. We fell. We're looking for a way out." The commander, because that was clearly what she was, tilted her head at an angle that conveyed absolutely nothing. Then, she said something else, to someone behind her, and 2 soldiers moved around the semicircle toward them. Mara didn't move. Moving would have been wrong. The math was still simple. 3 humans, a city full of unknowns. No information about their intentions. You don't throw the first punch when you're surrounded and outnumbered. You gather information. Ben, to his credit, didn't move either. Mara, whose ankle was now a sustained, unignorable problem, was leaning hard on Mara's shoulder and staying very still and breathing through it. All three of them standing there in the amber half-light with the pale eyes of an unknown civilization watching them, and none of them screaming. Mara thought, that's something. That's actually something. Not trained, not drilled, just the human ability to hold still in the face of the incomprehensible, to absorb it and wait for more data rather than immediately detonating. She'd seen trained soldiers do worse. The soldiers took them to a building near the center of the city. They were not harmed. That was the first piece of information. The soldiers moved them with careful, precise direction. A gesture here, a pressure on the shoulder there, and kept a distance that felt more like protocol than aggression. The building they were brought to was warmer than the streets and had furniture that had been made without human ergonomics in mind, but was still recognizable as furniture. Things to sit on and lean against and set objects upon. They were left there, and the door was closed. And they were alone. Ben sat on the floor and pulled his knees to his chest. Kara took the closest seat thing, which was shaped like a saddle without a horse, and settled on it sideways and stared at the wall. Mara walked the perimeter of the room, checking for exits, textures, anything that told her something. She found one window, sealed but translucent, and through it she could see a different section of the city than the street they'd come in on. She could see what looked like a marshalling yard. Vehicles she had no category for, figures loading equipment onto them with systematic efficiency. She watched for 6 minutes. Then she went and sat with Ben and Kara. They're preparing something, she said. An invasion. The word sat in the room. Could be anything, Mara said. Could be, Kara said. But it's not anything, is it? It wasn't. The efficiency had a direction to it, a momentum. You didn't load vehicles like that for a domestic operation. You loaded vehicles like that when the target was somewhere you had to travel to. When the logistics were about transporting force across a distance, the math changed. There had been 3 variables, Voss, Ben, Kara. Now there was a 4th. Whatever was above them. Where there were 300 million people who had no idea this place existed. We need to talk to whoever's in charge, Mara said. Ben said, great plan. You have a better one? He didn't. The commander came back in the evening. Or what passed for evening. The ambient dome light shifted subtly redder, which seemed to be their day-night cycle. A thermal fluctuation rather than a sun setting. She came with a different figure this time. An older one, civilian clothes, or what read as civilian, less structured, worn in the soft way of long use. He moved differently from the soldiers, more patient, less precise. He sat across from Mara, on a flat-topped stone shelf, and placed his hands on his knees and looked at her the way a man looks at a complicated problem he has been handed and is genuinely interested in. Spoke. Same frequency, same click-vowel structure, incomprehensible. Then he did something unexpected. He produced a pad of something like paper and set it between them, and on it he had drawn a very simple diagram. A circle. Inside the circle, a smaller circle. An arrow from the inner circle pointing outward. He looked at Mara. She pointed at the arrow. He made a sound, not an agreement, not a denial, something more like a correction, a fine-tuning. He pointed at the inner circle, then at himself, then at the arrow again, then, very deliberately, upward at the sealed ceiling above them. Mara said, "You want to go up." He couldn't understand her. He watched her face with those pale, mirror-catching eyes, and something in her expression must have served. He tapped the diagram again, and this time there was an energy in it, an intensity. She thought about how to answer. She thought about everything she'd seen in the marshalling yard. Then she thought about something else. The way he was sitting. The patience of him. The fact that he had brought paper and a diagram. Fact that he was here, in this room, talking to her rather than walking past her. She pointed at herself, then at the ceiling. Then she put her hand flat, palm down, a universal gesture of stop, wait, hold. He tilted his head. That inhuman tilt again. She held the gesture. He was still for a long time. Then he took the paper back and set it aside, and looked at her with an expression she could not read but which felt, in the way that some things feel before you can name them. like consideration. He left without the soldiers taking her. Kara, from her saddle seat. What just happened? I don't know, Mara said. Something. His name, as best they could approximate it, was Galba, not the true pronunciation. The resonant chest frequency was beyond the range of human vocal production, but a close enough label to work with. He came back 3 more times over the next 2 cycles of the dome light, and each time he brought the paper, and each time he drew something different, and each time Mara answered, in the only way available to her. Gesture, expression, body angle, the semaphore of species that have never met but are made of the same evolutionary logic. He was a scientist, that was her read, or the nearest their civilization had to one. Not military, not religious. Something between those and something else. A person interested in cause and effect, in how things worked, in the mechanisms of other minds. He watched her the way she'd watched the marshalling yard. Systematically, with patience, gathering information. On his second visit he brought food, or what functioned as food. 2 shallow dishes of something warm and protein-dense that smelled of minerals and something faintly green, like moss. He placed one in front of himself, one in front of Mara. He waited. Mara looked at it. She thought about the calculus of refusing versus accepting. Refusing was a clean signal. I don't trust you. Distrust was already the ambient condition here. She didn't need to reinforce it. Accepting was more complicated. It said something and she wasn't sure exactly what. Then she thought, he went to the effort of bringing this. He is waiting for her to respond. He is interested in her response. That was the real content of the gesture, not the food itself. She ate. It tasted like nothing she had a comparison for. Not bad. Deeply unfamiliar in a way that was somehow neutral, like experiencing a color you'd never seen before, and finding that you had no instinctive reaction to it. Galba watched her face as she ate, with that systematic patience. Then he ate his own, and Mara watched his face in turn, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a room eating an unremarkable meal, which was its own kind of communication. Ben refused his on principle. Kara ate half of hers with the expressions of someone who has decided that uncertainty is preferable to hunger. On his 3rd visit, Galba brought a 3rd figure with him, younger, nervous, who turned out to be something like a translator in training, or at least a person whose specific skill set involved pattern recognition in foreign acoustic inputs. They couldn't speak to Mara's language, but they could, over time, match her mouth shapes to contexts and build a rough index of meaning. It was slow work. It was the right work. Mara started talking more. Not briefings, not tactical analysis, not requests, just talking. She talked about the cave and the volcano and the closed park and the absurd chain of events that had put 3 civilians in her path that day. She talked about her job and what the word sergeant meant, and what the chain of command looked like, and why she'd gone under the tape. She talked about the surface, not geopolitically, not strategically, just what it felt like. The rain, the specific quality of outdoor air. The way the sky looked different at every hour. And you stopped noticing it, and then sometimes, out of nowhere, it hit you. She watched Galba's face while she talked. The translator in training made notes in a medium she couldn't read, and Galba listened with an attention so complete it was almost uncomfortable. The way a very good doctor listens, not waiting for the symptom, but genuinely following the whole story. He drew a human figure once rudimentary, not unkind. He placed it next to a figure that was taller, different proportioned, his people. He drew lines between them. Then he erased the lines and drew different ones. She thought about it. Then she took the paper from him. He let her, which mattered, and she drew a 3rd figure, smaller, placed it between the 2. He looked at it for a long time. Then he drew more of the smaller figures, a crowd of them. He looked at her. She pointed at the ceiling, held his gaze, nodded. Something shifted in his face. Fear, not quite, more like scale. Like a number he'd been working with had just added several zeros. She watched him sit with it. This was something she'd learned young. That the most important part of giving someone information they weren't ready for is the silence that comes after. You don't fill it. You let the number do its work. She'd given bad news to families before. The particular awful geometry of that task, the way the words land, and then the room goes quiet and everything after is just time. This wasn't grief, but the silence had the same shape. Finally he tapped the paper again. Not the figures, the lines between them. He tapped the space where lines had been drawn and erased. She nodded. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he folded the paper and put it inside his clothes and left. Ben was watching from the corner. Chin on knees, he said. You're telling him how many people are up there? I'm telling him what an invasion actually means, Mara said. 3 cycles later, she heard the argument. It came through the walls of their room, muffled by distance and the resonant properties of the architecture. But she'd been listening for anything. Texture, inflection, rhythm, and what she heard was unmistakable. Disagreement. Commander's voice sharp and rapid. Galba's voice slower, sustained, pushing back. Other voices. The sound of a council not reaching consensus. Fra said, Is that a good sign? It means there's more than one opinion, Mara said. One opinion is easy to fight. More than one is complicated. Complicated is usually better. She was wrong about the timeline. The soldiers came for them in the reddest part of the cycle, when the dome light was low and warm, and the city moved at its quietest. 4 soldiers, the commander behind them. The commander had a different quality now. Something contained, tightened, the look of a decision made after argument. She spoke to Mara directly, and there was no Galba here to manage the gap. And Mara understood nothing except the direction. Out the door, into the street. They were taken to the marshalling yard. The vehicles were loaded. The efficiency Mara had watched from the window was complete now. These were not explorers, not diplomats, not a survey party. The force assembled here was scaled to take something, and it was ready. Put herself between the commander and the way forward. It was, on one level, absurd. She was one person. She had no weapon. The space between her and the commander was 3 meters of open ground, and the commander was flanked by 2 soldiers who outmassed Mara by a significant margin. She stood there. The commander stopped. She looked at Mara, that long pale iris look, and waited. Mara said, I need you to wait. She said it with her whole body. She said it with stillness. She said it the way she'd said it to Ben in the cave, to a young man who was 13 and afraid, and had gone toward the dark anyway, which was something she understood and had some use for. She said, I need 1 hour, 1 cycle of light. She held up a finger, then both hands, suggesting a slow cycle, then pointed at the vehicles and shook her head, once clearly. The commander watched her. A long moment, the longest of Mara's life, possibly, longer than she'd realized a moment could be, expanded by the absolute weight of what was on either side of it. Then, Galba's voice came from somewhere behind the assembled soldiers. He pushed through. It was astonishing to watch. The soldiers parting for him not because of rank, but because of something else. The social force of a person who is known to be right about things, and is feared for it in a particular way. He moved to stand beside Mara, and he held the paper diagram, a new one drawn in haste, lines still fresh, and he showed it to the commander. Mara didn't know what it said. She would never know. The commander looked at it, and looked at Mara, and looked back at it. And the specific quality of her face in that moment was something Mara had seen before on the faces of commanders who had just been handed a cost that they hadn't accounted for. The commander said something. Short, clipped. The soldiers around the vehicles didn't move. Nobody moved. Galba looked at Mara. She looked at him. He tapped the diagram. Then he tapped the ceiling and held up one finger. She nodded. One chance. She understood. She had no idea how to use it, but she understood. Ben had been standing slightly behind her through all of this. He was 13. And he was not trained, and he had no specific skills relevant to first contact negotiations with an underground civilization. He had watched everything with the absolute attention of a young person who understands that the adults in the room are genuinely uncertain, and that understanding had produced in him a stillness that was not passivity. He touched Mara's elbow now. She turned, he said. I know how to get back to the chute. I memorized the route. She stared at him. While they were walking us here, he said, I was counting turns. 40 meters north, then left, then 45 meters, then left again through the arch with the notch in it. It's not exact, but it's close. Chute took us about 200 meters horizontal east and 300 down. So back is west and up, and there are vents in the cavern walls every 60 meters. I saw them on the walk. She said, How? I just remember things, he said. I always have. My brother calls it annoying. She looked at him for a beat. Then she thought about what Galba had just drawn on that paper, the inner circle, the outer circle, the arrow, question it represented, and the answer she'd been trying to give him, and the thing she hadn't found the language for until right now. She turned back to Galba. She took the paper from him. He let her. She drew 2 arrows, one pointing up, one pointing down. She drew them parallel. He looked at her. She circled both arrows. Pale eyes moved over the diagram, then up to her face, then back. He made a sound. Not words, not quite, but something, with the shape of a question. She nodded. He was still for a very long time. Then he turned to the commander and said something. And this time it was not an argument, not a pushback against force. It was something else. The tone of it was the tone of someone offering a different frame for the same picture. The commander's answer took a long time. When it came quietly, and it came with something Mara hadn't heard in her voice before. Uncertainty. Galba turned back to Mara. He tapped the diagram. Then he pointed at her, and at himself, and at the ceiling. She understood him perfectly. Getting back to the chute was harder than Ben had made it sound, which was to say it was about as hard as she'd expected. A 13-year-old's spatial memory versus the actual geometry of an alien city in amber half-light. They got turned around twice. The second time, one of the soldiers, theirs, Galba's, accompanying rather than escorting, made a gesture that they initially read as threat and then realized was direction. The soldier knew a shorter path. The soldier took them. The chute was there. Raw rock edges, the fresh break of the floor above still visible. 300 meters of compacted ash, curving toward a gray rectangle of light at the top. That was the most beautiful thing. Mara. She was starting to think of his days, even though she'd lost all sense of time underground. She looked at Galba. He was standing at the base of the chute, with his paper, and his pale eyes and his patience. And he was looking up at that rectangle of light, with an expression she finally had a name for. Not ambition, not hunger. Not the calculation of a commander assessing terrain, longing, she said. Come on, then. It came out without thinking, and he couldn't understand it anyway, but the gesture was clear enough. She nodded toward the chute, and he followed. 40 minutes to climb. What had taken seconds to fall? The ash was loose, and the angle was steep, and Kara made it on one good ankle and sheer stubbornness, which Mara clocked and filed for later. Ben went first because he was lightest, and his hands were the right size for the irregular handholds. Galba climbed in the middle, methodical and sure-footed in a way that suggested the vertical was not foreign to him. Went last, keeping one eye below, listening for the commander's change of mind, which did not come. The climb was its own strange kind of conversation. There was no paper here, no diagram, no translator in training taking notes. Just the shared problem of the angle, and the ash and the handholds, that were never quite where you wanted them. Galba paused twice, once to wait for Kara, once when a section of the chute shifted and shed material down past them in a slow gray cascade. Both times he looked back at Mara, and she gave him a signal she wasn't sure he understood. A nod, a flat palm, steady, steady. And both times he waited until she returned it, and then continued. That was a kind of vocabulary too, she filed it. The rectangle of light resolved into a broken cave ceiling, and then into open air, and then into a sky that was blue and enormous and smelled of sulfur and rain. The volcano was lower now. The bleeding light from earlier, reduced to a slow orange thread along the north face. The sun was real and specific, and it was hitting the black rock field at a low angle, and the shadows were long, and everything was the exact gray-gold color of late afternoon. Galba came out of the cave last. He stood at the mouth of it and looked up. The sky was his size, finally. The scale of it, open, boundless, lit by a sun that had no ceiling, moved through him the way a current moves through water. Watched his face go through something she couldn't name and didn't need to. Ben sat down on the nearest rock and looked at the sky and said nothing. Stood beside him and put her hand on his shoulder. Mara's radio crackled. She clicked it. Static. Then her commander's voice, distant, broken by interference but recognizable, she said, "This is Voss. I have the 2 civilians. We're at the cave mouth. We need a medical team for a sprained ankle." Her commander said, "Voss, what is your status?" "Ambulatory," she said. "All 3 of us." She looked at Galba. He was still watching the sky. "4 of us," she said, a pause on the radio. "Say again?" I said 4. A diplomatic team. And make sure they have a linguist. Another pause. Longer. Shh. Voss. What exactly happened down there? She thought about the 40 meters of cave and the crack in the floor and the 300-meter drop and the amber dome and the city and the soldiers in the marshalling yard and the commander's face and the way Galba had drawn that arrow and the moment she had taken his paper and drawn 2 of them. She thought about Ben's spatial memory, about Kura's ankle and the silence with which she'd climbed 300 meters on it, about the small human things that had done the work when nothing else could. The diagram understood, the gesture held, the door that had stayed open because she had stood in it with no weapon, but the simple argument of her presence. She said, "Something we'll need a while to explain." Then she put the radio down and stood next to Galba on the black rock of the lava field, and they both looked at the sky, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything because there was nothing that either of them had words for yet. Crater was still smoking, far to the north, a thin white column going up into blue. The shadow of it bent eastward in the wind. Everything else was still. After a while, Ben said, "Do you think they'll actually stop?" "The invasion thing," Mara said. "I think he'll argue for it. Is that enough?" She thought about the diagram. 2 arrows. The question of whether parallel was possible. Whether 2 things could go in the same direction without one of them destroying the other. It was a very old question. It had never been answered cleanly, but it had sometimes been answered. "It's enough to keep arguing," she said. Kara looked sideways at her, and there was something in her face. Dry, specific, the humor of a woman who has been through something unreasonable, and come out the other side still capable of irony. That said, "That's the most diplomatic thing I've ever heard from someone who spent 30 minutes bodily blocking an invasion force." Mara almost laughed. Then the first of the helicopters appeared over the ridge, and the sound of it came down through the clean air like something ordinary and irreplaceable. And Galba looked up at it with his pale eyes wide and careful and full of everything he didn't have words for yet either. It took 3 months for the first formal exchange, 8 months for a stable communication framework built by a team of linguists and acousticians, and one very patient xenobiologist who kept saying the word unprecedented with the enthusiasm of someone who'd waited their whole career for it. It took almost 2 years for the first joint summit, which was held underground by their preference and above ground by ours, and the compromise location, a purpose-built facility at the cave mouth in Hawaii, half sunk into the earth, was not elegant, but it worked. Galba was at all of it. He had a gift for the gap. The space between languages, between frames, between ways of understanding the same thing from different angles. The linguist said he had an exceptional ability to model inference, to guess at meaning from context and gesture and the logic of a situation. Mara thought that was probably just what you developed when you spent a long time trying to understand things that were difficult. She was at most of it too on the human side. Not as a diplomat. She was not a diplomat, and had been told this in polite and official terms by several people whose job it was to be polite and official about things. She was there as something with less title and more function. The person who knew the shape of the early contact. The person Galba would look for when a meeting got difficult, and whose presence, across the table, 2 meters away, saying nothing, seemed to settle something in him that the formal proceedings couldn't reach. She didn't mind the meetings. She minded the paperwork that came with them, which was extensive, and had an implication she didn't love. That what she'd done in that cave, standing in front of an assembled invasion force with no authority and no weapon, and nothing but the math of presence, was going to be in documents, official ones, with her name on them. Her commander had told her, very early on, that she would be celebrated for what she'd done. She'd told him that celebrated was a funny word for it. He'd asked what word she'd prefer. She'd thought about Galba at the base of the chute, looking up at the rectangle of light. About the 2 arrows, parallel, going the same direction. She said ongoing. He hadn't fully understood that either. Ben visited the facility once, at 15 as part of a youth delegation that his school had lobbied very hard to include. He was taller. He still remembered everything. Turns, distances, the angle of light from the dome. He stood in the half-sunk conference hall and looked at the Atlantean delegation across the table, and then looked at Mara, who was standing to the side of the room in her unofficial official capacity. And he grinned the way 13-year-olds grin when they have been right about something important and have finally been proven right in a room full of adults. She gave him a look that meant, yes, fine. He gave her a look that meant 40 meters north, then left, then 45 meters. She gave him a look that meant, I know. The meeting was about mineral rights, which was not the most cinematic possible subject for the next stage of human-Atlantean relations, but it was real and difficult, and full of the specific texture of two groups of people who are trying to build something that has never been built before, without a blueprint, using the tools available. Tools available were patience, gesture, the willingness to hold a position without throwing the first punch, the ability to draw two arrows where there had been one, and the willingness, when the ground dropped away and the dark was absolute, to keep going anyway, not because there was no fear, but because the math came out the same. Forward. Mara Voss was very good at math.